He thought forcing her to play would humiliate her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he was about to destroy his own reputation in a room that never forgives mistakes. The Whitmore Conservatory stood like a monument to perfection, its marble floors gleaming under chandeliers that cast a soft golden glow across polished Steinway pianos and rows of velvet seats. The kind of place where talent was measured in precision and status was worn like a second skin. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Jonathan Pierce, a man whose reputation carried as much weight as the institution itself, known not only for his brilliance, but for his quiet intolerance toward anyone he deemed unworthy of the stage, his tailored navy suit sharp against the backdrop of black lacquered instruments, his silver hair perfectly combed as he surveyed the rehearsal hall with an air of ownership, because in his mind, this was his kingdom and everyone in it played by his rules, especially today, the day of the conservatory's most prestigious evaluation, where donors and board members would gather to witness excellence and nothing less. Across the room, barely noticeable among the movement of students and faculty, was Clara Whitmore, a woman most people had never truly seen, her simple gray cardigan slightly worn at the sleeves, her dark hair pulled back into a modest bun, her movements quiet and efficient as she wiped fingerprints from a piano lid with practiced care. The kind of presence that blended so seamlessly into the background it almost disappeared. And yet there was something about her stillness, something deliberate, as if she chose invisibility rather than being assigned it. But no one in that room was looking closely enough to notice, not when their attention was fixed on status, performance, and the unspoken hierarchy that dictated who mattered and who didn't. Dr. Pierce's voice cut cleanly through the air, sharp and controlled, as he addressed a group of advanced students gathered near the grand piano, his tone carrying just enough impatience to remind them of their place. "We are not here to be adequate. We are here to be exceptional," he said, his eyes scanning the room. Before pausing briefly on Clara, not with recognition, but with dismissal, the kind of glance that categorized and discarded in the same breath, and then just as quickly, he turned away, already uninterested, because in his world, people like her simply did not belong in conversations about mastery. The tension in the room shifted moments later when a nervous assistant hurried toward him, whispering something urgent, and for the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his otherwise composed expression, the kind of disruption he did not tolerate, especially not on a day like this. And as murmurs began to ripple through the students, it became clear that one of the featured performers had failed to arrive. A critical absence that threatened to leave a gap in the carefully curated program. And for a man like Dr. Pierce, a gap was unacceptable, because perfection allowed no room for unpredictability. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room again, this time not searching for excellence, but for convenience, for something or someone that could be used to fill the void without compromising his authority. And then his eyes landed on Clara, standing quietly beside the piano she had just finished cleaning, her hands folded calmly in front of her, unaware that she had just become the solution to a problem she didn't create. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, touched the corner of his lips, not out of kindness, but calculation, and he stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor as the room instinctively fell silent, sensing that something was about to unfold, something unusual. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a tone that was deceptively light, almost amused. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the piano, "it seems we have an unexpected opportunity for demonstration." And few students exchanged glances, already sensing the setup, the subtle shift from performance to spectacle. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze with steady eyes, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed between them, something Dr. Pierce chose to ignore as he continued. "You," he said, his hand extending toward her with deliberate precision. "You've been around these instruments long enough, haven't you? Why don't you show us what you've learned?" And the words hung in the air, polite on the surface but edged with something sharper beneath, an invitation designed not for success, but for exposure, for the quiet humiliation that came from stepping into a role you were never meant to fill. And as a few soft chuckles began to ripple through the room, the stage was set, not for music, but for a moment that everyone believed would confirm exactly what they already thought they knew. The laughter did not erupt all at once. It spread slowly, like a ripple across still water, starting from the back rows where a few students exchanged knowing glances before letting out quiet smirks, and then moving forward as confidence grew in the shared assumption that this moment would be nothing more than a brief and forgettable embarrassment, the kind that reinforced the invisible lines everyone in that room understood but never spoke aloud. And Clara Whitmore stood at the center of it. Without reacting, her posture straight, her hands still resting lightly against each other as if she had not yet decided whether to move, her expression calm in a way that seemed almost out of place against the rising tension. Because while others saw a woman being singled out, she experienced something entirely different, something quieter, something deeper, as if the noise around her had already begun to fade into the background. Dr. Jonathan Pierce took a step back, folding his arms with measured satisfaction, giving her the stage in a way that felt less like permission and more like a test designed to fail. And his voice carried again, smooth and controlled. "Take your time," he said, though the subtle edge beneath his tone suggested he expected hesitation, perhaps even refusal, because refusal would confirm what he already believed, that she did not belong there, that she would retreat to the safety of invisibility, where she had always existed. But Clara did not retreat. Instead, she turned toward the piano with unhurried steps, each movement deliberate, unshaken by the attention now fully fixed upon her. And as she reached the bench, she paused for just a fraction of a second, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished surface as if greeting something familiar rather than foreign. The room shifted again, the murmurs quieting into a tense anticipation, not out of respect, but curiosity, the kind that comes before a predictable outcome. And one of the students near the front leaned toward another, whispering just loud enough to be heard, "This is going to be painful to watch." And a few nearby heads nodded in agreement, their expectations already sealed, their judgments already complete. Because in their world, mastery required recognition, and recognition had never once been given to someone like her. Clara lowered herself onto the bench, adjusting her position with a natural ease that went unnoticed by most, but caught the attention of one or two faculty members who could not quite explain why something about her movements felt precise, practiced, as if she had done this before, though that thought was quickly dismissed, because it did not fit the narrative they had already accepted. Dr. Pierce stepped forward once more, placing a sheet of music onto the stand with deliberate emphasis, the title alone enough to draw a subtle reaction from those who recognized it. A notoriously complex composition known for its demanding tempo changes and intricate phrasing, the kind of piece that even advanced students approached with caution, and he tapped the page lightly, his gaze returning to Clara with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "This should be appropriate," he said, his voice carrying across the room, and there was something unmistakable in the way he chose that word, something that suggested this was not about suitability, but spectacle. Clara glanced at the sheet for only a brief moment, her eyes moving across the notes with quiet focus. And then she lifted her gaze, not to the audience, not to Dr. Pierce, but somewhere inward, as if aligning herself with something only she could hear. And for a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it, caught in a pause that felt longer than it was. Then came the smallest shift, almost imperceptible, as her shoulders relaxed and her hands rose toward the keys, hovering just above them, not trembling, not uncertain, simply waiting. And in that stillness, something changed, something subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that could not be explained through logic alone. And even Dr. Pierce, standing just a few feet away, felt it, though he could not name it. A faint disruption in his certainty that flickered and then disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced once again by the confidence that this moment would unfold exactly as he expected. Somewhere in the room, a chair creaked softly as someone adjusted their posture, leaning forward slightly, drawn in despite themselves, and the air seemed to tighten, as if the space itself understood that what was about to happen would not follow the script that had already been written in everyone's minds. And yet no one spoke, no one interrupted, because anticipation had replaced amusement. And in that fragile silence, Clara Whitmore placed her fingers gently onto the keys, not like a novice, approaching something unfamiliar, but like someone returning to a language she had never forgotten. And just before the first note, Her eyes opened fully, steady and clear, carrying a quiet certainty that no one in that room was prepared to understand. The first note did not explode into the room the way they expected. It did not stumble or hesitate or betray uncertainty. Instead, it emerged with a quiet precision that settled into the air like it had always belonged there. And for a split second, no one reacted because their minds had not yet caught up with what their ears had just registered. The tone was clean, controlled, intentional, and Clara Whitmore did not rush. She allowed the silence between notes to breathe, shaping the opening. Phrased with a restraint that spoke of understanding rather than imitation, and a subtle shift moved through the audience. Not yet recognition, but confusion, the kind that begins when expectations start to fracture. Dr. Jonathan Pierce remained still, his arms still folded, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not in approval, not yet, but in recalculation. Because the mistake he had anticipated did not arrive, and as Clara continued, her fingers moving across the keys with increasing fluidity, the structure of the piece began to unfold exactly as it was written. No shortcuts, no simplifications, every dynamic respected, every transition deliberate, and the murmurs that had lingered earlier faded into something else, something quieter, more focused, as if the room itself was beginning to listen rather than judge. A student in the second row leaned forward, his expression tightening as he followed the progression, recognizing passages he himself had struggled to master, and beside him, another whispered under his breath, "She is not guessing." And that realization spread faster than the earlier laughter had, because what they were witnessing could not be dismissed as luck or coincidence. It demanded attention, and Clara did not acknowledge any of it. Her posture remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze soft but fixed, as if she was not performing for anyone in that room, but instead reconnecting with something deeply familiar, something that existed long before this moment. The tempo shifted, the complexity deepened, and where hesitation should have appeared, there was none, her hands moving with a confidence that did not need to prove itself, each phrase building upon the last with a clarity that revealed not only technical mastery, but interpretation, the kind of interpretation that could not be taught in classrooms or measured in evaluations. And somewhere near the back, a faculty member who had been watching with mild amusement now straightened in his seat, his expression changing from casual interest to something sharper, more alert, because he understood what others were only beginning to sense. This was not a demonstration. This was command. Dr. Pierce took a slow step forward without realizing it, drawn closer by something he could not quite control, his earlier confidence beginning to erode under the weight of what he was hearing, because the performance unfolding in front of him did not align with the narrative he had constructed, and yet he said nothing, because there was nothing he could say. Without exposing the shift that was happening inside him, and the room, once filled with quiet superiority, now held a different kind of silence, one that carried tension instead of dismissal, one that demanded attention instead of offering judgment. Clara moved into the most demanding section of the piece, the passage that separated competence from mastery, and a few students instinctively held their breath, anticipating the moment where control would break, where the illusion would collapse. But it did not collapse, it expanded, her fingers accelerating with precision, her timing exact, her expression unchanged, and the sound that filled the hall was no longer surprising. It was undeniable, the kind of sound that left no room for doubt. And one by one, the assumptions that had defined her presence in that room began to fall away, not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, like something being replaced rather than destroyed. And in that quiet transformation, Dr. Pierce felt it fully for the first time, not confusion, not curiosity, but the unmistakable realization that he had misjudged something fundamental, and the room, though still silent, was no longer waiting for failure. It was waiting for something else entirely, something no one had planned for, something that could not be undone. The music did not merely continue, it evolved, unfolding into something far beyond the written notes on the page. And as Clara Whitmore moved deeper into the composition, the boundaries between performance and expression began to dissolve, her fingers no longer just executing sequences, but shaping meaning, drawing emotion out of each phrase with a control that felt effortless yet unmistakably intentional. And the room, once filled with quiet superiority, now held a tension that no one could escape, because what they were witnessing demanded a recalibration of everything they thought they understood about her, about talent, about presence itself. The chandeliers above seemed to glow a little softer, the reflections on the polished floor no longer distracting, but still, as if even the space itself had settled into the rhythm she created. And somewhere near the front, one of the senior instructors slowly lowered the pen he had been holding, his notes forgotten mid-sentence, his attention fully captured by the realization forming in his mind. This was not an anomaly. This was mastery revealed. Dr. Jonathan Pierce stood unmoving, but the certainty that had once defined his posture was gone, replaced by something far less comfortable, a quiet unraveling that he could not mask, his gaze fixed on Clara as if searching for a flaw, a mistake, any indication that this moment could still align with his expectations. But there was none, only precision, only clarity, only a presence that grew stronger with every passing measure. And for the first time, he understood that he was no longer in control of what was happening in his own hall. Clara transitioned seamlessly into the final movement, the most demanding portion of the piece, where speed, control, and emotional depth had to exist in perfect balance, and the audience, now fully aware of what they were witnessing, leaned into the silence, not out of politeness, but out of necessity, because interrupting even a single second of this performance felt unthinkable. And the earlier whispers, the quiet laughter, the dismissive glances had all vanished, replaced by something heavier, something undeniable, the weight of recognition settling across the room like a truth no one could avoid. A student who had once smirked now sat completely still, his eyes fixed on Clara's hands, trying to follow movements that seemed almost impossible to replicate. And beside him, another shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if conceding something she had not expected to lose, the certainty of her own place in the hierarchy that had once felt so secure. The tempo surged, the notes cascading with flawless articulation, and yet there was no tension in Clara's expression, no sign of strain, only a calm focus that suggested she was not reaching for the music, but guiding it, shaping it, owning it in a way that transcended the very structure of the piece. And in that moment, the difference between training and understanding became unmistakably clear, because what she carried could not be taught within the walls of that conservatory. It existed beyond it. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened ever so slightly, a reaction so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the complete stillness surrounding him, and his hands, once folded with confidence, now hung loosely at his sides, a small but undeniable shift that spoke louder than any words he could have offered, because he knew, even before the final note, that this moment would not belong to him, it would belong to her, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. The final passage approached, a sequence known for exposing even the most skilled performers, and the room braced itself, not for failure, but for confirmation, for the completion of something they had already begun to accept as extraordinary. And Clara did not rush it. She allowed each note to land with intention, each phrase to resolve with clarity, building toward an ending that felt inevitable, yet entirely her own. And when the final chord resonated through the hall, it did not fade. Immediately, it lingered, filling the space with a presence that extended beyond sound, beyond expectation, beyond everything that had led to this moment. And then, as the last vibration dissolved into silence, no one moved, no one spoke, because the room had finally reached a truth it could not ignore. And in that stillness, the hierarchy that once defined them all had quietly begun to collapse. For a moment that stretched longer than anyone expected, the room remained completely still, as if even the air itself had paused to acknowledge what had just happened. And Clara Whitmore did not move immediately, her hands resting lightly above the keys where the final chord had just faded, her posture composed, her expression unchanged, as though the performance had not been an act of defiance or proof, but simply a return to something that had always belonged to her. And it was in that quiet, in that unclaimed moment, that the weight of realization settled fully across the room. Then, almost hesitantly at first, a single sound broke through the silence. Not laughter, not a whisper, but the soft, unmistakable clap of hands, and it came from the far side of the hall, where one of the senior faculty members sat, his expression no longer guarded but openly respectful. And that single gesture seemed to release something in the others, because within seconds, the sound multiplied, applause rising in waves, growing louder, fuller, until it filled the entire conservatory with a recognition that could no longer be contained or denied. Students who had once exchanged amused glances now stood, their reactions no longer restrained, their admiration unfiltered, and even those who had been most certain of her limitations found themselves clapping, not out of obligation, but because anything less would have felt dishonest, because what they had witnessed demanded acknowledgement. Clara slowly lowered her hands from the keys and rose from the bench with the same quiet grace she had carried into the moment, her gaze not seeking validation, not searching the room for approval, but steady and inward, as if the applause, no matter how overwhelming, did not define what had just occurred, and that calm, that refusal to claim the moment in the way others expected, only deepened the impact she had already made. Dr. Jonathan Pierce did not join the applause at first, his hands remaining still at his sides, his expression fixed in a way that betrayed nothing and yet revealed everything. Because behind the controlled exterior, something had shifted in a way he could not reverse, the certainty that had once anchored him replaced by a realization he could not dismiss. And when he finally brought his hands together, the gesture felt measured, deliberate, as though he was acknowledging not just the performance, but the error that had led to it, though no words followed, because words would have required him to admit what the entire room already understood. Clara turned slightly, stepping away from the piano, and for the first time since the performance began, her eyes lifted toward the audience, not in triumph, not in challenge, but in quiet recognition, as if she understood exactly what they were feeling without needing to respond to it. And then she did something no one expected. She inclined her head gently, a small gesture of respect, not for their applause, but for the music itself, and began to walk toward the edge of the stage. The applause did not fade as she moved. If anything, it intensified, following her with a persistence that seemed almost reluctant to let her go, as though the room was trying to hold on to something it had only just discovered. But Clara did not slow. She did not turn back. She simply continued forward with the same calm presence she had always carried, leaving behind a silence that would feel different now, heavier, more aware. Near the front, one of the students who had whispered earlier sat frozen, his hands still mid-clap as realization settled fully into his expression, and beside him, another lowered her gaze, not out of shame, but out of reflection, because what had just unfolded was not only a performance, it was a correction, a quiet dismantling of assumptions they had not even realized they held so tightly. Dr. Pierce remained where he stood, watching as Clara reached the edge of the stage and stepped down without ceremony, his mind replaying the moment in fragments, searching for the point where control had slipped from his grasp, where certainty had given way to truth, and finding none, because the truth had been there from the beginning, unnoticed, dismissed, waiting. The applause gradually softened as Clara moved toward the back of the hall, blending once again into the space she had always occupied. But the difference now was undeniable, because invisibility was no longer something imposed upon her. It was something she chose, and in that choice, there was a power that the room could not ignore. And as the final claps faded into a lingering quiet, no one spoke. No one attempted to restore the previous order, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone. And in that silence, the conservatory, for the first time, understood that greatness does not announce itself, it reveals itself, and when it does, it leaves no room for doubt. The applause had faded, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than anything that had come before, not empty, but filled with something unspoken, something that lingered in the air like a question. No one quite knew how to ask, and across the conservatory, people began to shift in their seats, not because they were ready to move on, but because they were trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with everything they thought they understood about the world they belonged to. And in that uneasy stillness, Clara Whitmore had already disappeared into the background once more, her footsteps quiet against the marble floor as she returned to the edges of the room, where she had always been, where no one had ever thought to look twice. A low murmur began to build, cautious at first, as students leaned toward one another, Their voices no longer filled with mockery, but with uncertainty. "Who is she?" one asked under his breath, and another shook his head slowly, unable to answer, because there was no answer that fit within the boundaries they had accepted. No explanation that made sense of what had just happened without forcing them to question something deeper about themselves. Near the front, a senior instructor adjusted his glasses, his eyes still fixed on the piano, as if expecting it to reveal something more, and beside him, another faculty member let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. "That was not training," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else, and the words carried a weight that those close enough to hear could not ignore, because they pointed to a truth that went beyond technique, beyond curriculum, beyond the carefully constructed system that had defined excellence within those walls for decades. Dr. Jonathan Pierce remained motionless for several seconds longer, his gaze still directed toward the space where Clara had been sitting, as if the absence itself held more meaning than her presence ever had. And when he finally turned, the shift was subtle but unmistakable, his posture still straight, his expression still controlled, but the certainty that had once anchored him was no longer there, replaced by something quieter, something more measured. And as he stepped forward, the room instinctively fell silent again, not out of fear, but out of attention, because whatever he said next would carry the weight of everything that had just occurred. He did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to reclaim authority through force or correction. Instead, he spoke with a calm that felt different from before, less absolute, more deliberate. "The evaluation will resume," he said, his tone even, but lacking the sharp edge that had once defined it. And for a moment, no one moved, because the words, though simple, felt insufficient against the magnitude of what had just taken place, as if returning to routine required an agreement that had not yet been reached. A student near the center hesitated before gathering his sheet music, his movements slower than usual, his focus fractured, and across the room, others followed, though the energy had shifted, no longer driven by competition or expectation, but by something quieter, more introspective, as if each person was now measuring themselves against a standard they had not previously recognized. In the back of the hall, Clara paused beside the piano she had been cleaning earlier, her hand resting lightly against its surface once again. The same gesture, the same position, but everything around her had changed, and yet she remained exactly as she had been, composed, unassuming, untouched by the need to explain or assert what had just been revealed, because for her, there was nothing to prove, nothing to reclaim, only something to continue. A young student approached her cautiously, stopping a few feet away as if unsure whether to speak, his earlier confidence replaced by hesitation, and when he finally found his voice, it was softer than before. "That was incredible," he said, the words simple, but genuine, and Clara turned slightly, meeting his gaze with a quiet steadiness, offering a small nod, not dismissive, not indulgent, simply acknowledging. And then she returned her attention to the piano, her hand moving once more to wipe away a faint smudge that had nothing to do with what had just happened and everything to do with who she had always been. Across the room, Dr. Pierce watched this exchange from a distance, his eyes narrowing not in judgment, but in recognition, as if he was beginning to understand that the moment he had orchestrated had revealed far more than he intended, not just about her, but about himself, about the limits of his perception, about the cost of certainty. And though he said nothing, though he made no attempt to call her forward again, the silence between them carried a different weight now, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by awareness. And in that awareness, something fundamental had shifted, something that would not return to its previous state, no matter how carefully the routine was restored, because once truth is seen, it does not disappear, it waits, quietly, for those willing to recognize it again. The room attempted to return to its rhythm, but something subtle refused to settle back into place, as if the performance had left an imprint that could not be erased by routine alone, and one by one, the students resumed their positions at their instruments, though their movements lacked the sharp confidence from before, replaced instead by a quiet hesitation, a lingering awareness that something beyond their structured training had just been revealed in front of them, something they could not easily replicate or categorize. A young pianist near the center began his assigned piece, his fingers moving correctly across the keys, technically sound, precise in execution, yet the sound that filled the hall felt different now, thinner somehow, as if the comparison had already been made in every listener's mind, not consciously, but inevitably, and as he played, he glanced briefly toward the back of the room where Clara Whitmore stood, as though searching for something he could not name, and when he looked back to his music, his tempo faltered just slightly, enough to betray the shift inside him. Across the conservatory, similar moments unfolded, small disruptions that revealed a larger truth, a recalibration taking place not through instruction, but through experience, because what Clara had done could not be unlearned by those who had witnessed it. And even the faculty, those who had spent years defining and defending the standards of excellence within those walls, now found themselves watching differently, listening differently, measuring with a new awareness that unsettled their previous certainty. Dr. Jonathan Pierce moved slowly along the aisle, his steps measured, his hands clasped behind his back once more, but the authority in his presence had changed, not diminished, but altered, tempered by something that resembled restraint. And as he paused beside a student struggling through a passage, he did not interrupt as he might have before, did not correct or critique. Instead, he listened, his gaze thoughtful, as if weighing something beyond accuracy, and after a moment, he simply nodded and continued on, leaving behind a silence that carried more meaning than any instruction he could have given. Near the back, Clara remained where she had been. Her attention returned to the quiet tasks that defined her role, adjusting a music stand, aligning sheet pages, restoring order in small, deliberate ways. And yet the space around her was no longer neutral, no longer invisible, because eyes found her now, not openly, not with the boldness of recognition, but with brief, thoughtful glances that lingered just long enough to acknowledge what had changed, and she did not respond to them, did not alter her pace or posture, because the shift that had occurred belonged to them, not to her. A senior instructor approached Dr. Pierce during a brief pause in the evaluations, his expression composed but curious. "We should review her background," he said quietly, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, and Dr. Pierce did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting once more toward Clara, as if considering the implications of that suggestion, because to investigate her would mean to confront the possibility that everything he believed about control, about recognition, about the structure of talent itself, had overlooked something essential, and after a moment, he replied, his tone even, perhaps, though the word carried a weight that suggested uncertainty rather than decision. The instructor nodded slowly, sensing the shift but not fully understanding it, and stepped away, leaving Dr. Pierce alone with his thoughts that no longer aligned as neatly as they once had, because the clarity he had relied upon had been replaced by questions that offered no immediate answers. Meanwhile, the evaluations continued, but each performance now existed in the shadow of something greater, something unspoken, and the students, whether they realized it or not, were no longer playing to impress or to prove. They were playing to understand, to reach for something they had only just glimpsed, and that pursuit changed everything. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, steadily, like a current beneath the surface that could not be seen but could always be felt. And through it all, Clara Whitmore remained unchanged, her presence steady, her actions consistent, as if the moment that had altered the room had simply passed through her without leaving a mark. But that was not entirely true, because while she did not seek acknowledgement, she had given something that could not be taken back, something that would continue to shape the space long after the final note had faded. And as the day moved forward, the conservatory, though outwardly the same, carried within it a new understanding, one that would not announce itself, but would remain, quietly, in every note played from that day on. By late afternoon, the conservatory no longer sounded the same, not because the instruments had changed, but because the ears that listened to them had. And as the final rounds of evaluation approached, a quiet tension lingered beneath every note, as if each performer now understood that precision alone was no longer enough, that something deeper had been revealed and could not be ignored. And across the hall, faculty members who once measured excellence through rigid standards now found themselves pausing longer, listening more carefully, searching for something they had not previously considered, something less visible but undeniably present. Dr. Jonathan Pierce stood near the center aisle once more, his posture still composed, his presence still commanding, yet the certainty that once defined him had been replaced by a thoughtful restraint. And as he observed the final student step away from the piano, he did not immediately speak, allowing the silence to settle, not as a tool of control, but as a space for reflection. And when he finally addressed the room, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, more deliberate. "Today," he began, his eyes moving across the students and faculty alike, "we have witnessed something that does not fit within our usual expectations." And the words, though measured, carried an acknowledgement that no one could misinterpret, because they pointed not to a single performance, but to a shift that had affected them all. A few students exchanged glances, their expressions no longer uncertain but contemplative, as if they were beginning to understand that the lesson of the day had not been assigned, had not been structured, but had emerged unexpectedly. And as Dr. Pierce continued, he did not raise his voice, did not attempt to reclaim authority through declaration. Instead, he allowed the weight of his words to carry the message. "Skill can be taught," he said, pausing briefly. "But understanding, that is, something else entirely." And the room remained silent, not out of obligation, but because the truth in those words resonated more deeply than any critique he had given before. Near the back, Clara Whitmore stood quietly beside the same piano she had tended earlier, her presence unchanged, her movements steady as she adjusted a music stand that had been left slightly out of place. And yet the space around her felt different now, no longer defined by invisibility, but by a quiet awareness that followed her wherever she moved. And though no one approached her directly, the glances she received were no longer dismissive. They were thoughtful, respectful in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud. A young woman who had performed earlier hesitated for a moment before walking toward Clara, stopping just a few feet away, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, as if unsure how to begin. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sincere. "I have been practicing that piece for 3 years, she said, her eyes steady. "And I still cannot play it the way you did." And Clara turned slightly, meeting her gaze with the same calm presence she had shown all day, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile, not in response to praise, but in acknowledgement of effort. And she replied simply, "Keep listening." The words quiet, but carrying a meaning that extended beyond the music itself. The student nodded slowly, as if she understood more than what had been said, and stepped back, leaving Clara once again alone with the quiet tasks that defined her role, though the meaning of those tasks had shifted in the eyes of everyone who watched. At the front of the hall, Dr. Pierce remained still for a moment longer after his final words, his gaze drifting once more toward Clara, and in that look, there was no longer dismissal, no trace of the earlier judgment that had shaped the day's beginning, only a recognition that something had been revealed beyond his control, beyond his design. And though he did not approach her, did not call her forward or offer public acknowledgement, the silence between them carried a different understanding. Now, one that did not require words to be felt. As the session came to a close, students began to gather their belongings, their conversations quieter than usual, their focus turned inward rather than outward, and the conservatory, though unchanged in its structure, no longer held the same certainty it had at the start of the day, because something essential had been questioned, something fundamental had been redefined. And as Clara Whitmore moved toward the exit, her steps as quiet as they had always been, she passed through the space, without drawing attention, without seeking it. And yet every person in that room felt the absence she left behind, not as a loss, but as a reminder that what they had witnessed was not a moment to be explained, but one to be remembered, because it had changed not the music, but the way they would hear it forever. The evening settled over the conservatory with a quiet calm that felt different from any other day, not because the building had changed, but because the people inside it had. And as the last of the students filtered out into the cool air, their conversations carried a tone that was softer, more reflective, as if each of them was holding on to something they had not yet fully understood but were not willing to let go of. And inside, the grand hall stood nearly empty, the polished pianos resting in stillness beneath the dimmed chandeliers, their surfaces reflecting a space that had witnessed something it would not soon forget. Clara Whitmore moved through the room one last time, her steps unhurried, her hands gently straightening a bench, aligning a sheet of music that had been left slightly askew. Her presence as quiet as it had always been, and yet the silence around her no longer felt like absence. It felt like acknowledgement, as if the walls themselves had taken note of what had passed between them earlier that day, and she did not linger. She did not pause to revisit the moment or claim it in any way, because, for her, it was never about being seen. It was about being true to something that had never required an audience. At the far end of the hall, Dr. Jonathan Pierce stood alone, his figure framed by the fading light that filtered through the tall windows. And for a long moment, he did not move, his gaze fixed on the piano where Clara had played, as if searching for an explanation that logic could not provide. And in that stillness, the weight of the day settled fully into him, not as a failure, but as a realization, one that did not accuse, but revealed, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he exhaled, the tension in his posture easing in a way that suggested acceptance rather than resistance. He walked forward, his footsteps measured, stopping beside the instrument, his hand resting lightly against its surface. And for the first time in years, he did not think about evaluation, about standards, about control. Instead, he thought about something simpler, something he had overlooked, the idea that mastery was not something granted by position or recognition, but something carried quietly, revealed only when the moment demanded it. And as he stood there, the echo of Clara's performance seemed to linger, not in sound, but in presence, a reminder that could not be dismissed or redefined. He did not call for her, did not seek her out, because he understood now that whatever needed to be said did not require words. And across the hall, Clara paused briefly at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she looked back for just a second, not at the room, not at the piano, but at the space as a whole. And there was no pride in her expression, no triumph, only a quiet understanding, as if she knew exactly what had changed and exactly what had not. And then she stepped out into the evening, her figure disappearing into the soft glow of the streetlights beyond, leaving behind a silence that felt complete rather than empty. The next morning, the conservatory would open its doors as it always did, students would return, lessons would continue, and on the surface, everything would appear unchanged. But beneath that routine, something deeper would remain, a shift in perception, a quiet awareness that would influence every note played within those walls. Because once a truth has been revealed, it does not vanish, it settles, it waits. It reshapes the way the world is understood, and those who had been present that day would carry it with them, whether they realized it or not. And somewhere beyond the reach of recognition, beyond the need for acknowledgement, Clara Whitmore continued her life as she always had, unchanged in her simplicity, unchanged in her quiet strength, because she had never needed the room to understand her in order to be who she was. And in that quiet, in that unspoken truth, the conservatory had learned something it would never formally teach, something that could not be written into any curriculum or measured by any standard. And that day, without announcement or ceremony, the meaning of excellence had been rewritten, not by authority, but by humility, not by recognition, but by truth. And in the stillness that followed, the world, for just a moment, remembered what dignity looks like.